Okay, this is part 2 of solving rational equations. In this video, we're going to look at a challenging example, and we're going to solve it using the process that we outlined in the first video. So here we go. Here's our rational equation. Notice we have x's on both top and bottom in some places within that equation. And we're going to start by looking for the restrictions. To find our restrictions, we look at the denominator of each of our fractions. The first one is x plus 3, which means we have a restriction at -3, because -3 would make that denominator 0. This denominator is just the number 2, there's no x there, so no restriction will come from our second fraction. And our last fraction, the value 1 would make that denominator 0, so that's our second restriction. So in this case, we have 2 restrictions on x. Now, we don't have to list it all the way down, but putting it right at the beginning is a great move, and that's sufficient. So first step is to move all of your terms to one side. There's already 2 terms on the left side, so we're going to move our term from the right side to the left side. And when you're moving a fraction, you're adding or subtracting the opposite. So in this case, this is a positive fraction, so we're going to subtract it on the left side. So here we go, 2x plus 3 over x plus 3 plus 1/2 minus x plus 1 over x minus 1. Equals 0. Step 2 is complete. Step 3 says to multiply both sides by the lowest common denominator. So the question is, what is the lowest common denominator? Well, the lowest common denominator will take each factor in the denominator of all of your fractions, multiply them all together, and then take out any parts that are common. So x plus 3 and x minus 1, there's nothing common there. Those are both separate factors, and the number 2 is not appearing in either of those denominators, so we actually are just going to take each part and multiply them together. So your lowest common denominator is 2 times x plus 3 times x minus 1. So your next step is to multiply both sides by that lowest common denominator. So what that's going to look like on the left side is, hopefully I left myself enough room here, 2 times x plus 3 times x minus 1, and we're going to multiply that whole thing by 2x plus 3 over x plus 3 plus 1/2 minus x plus 1 over x minus 1. Same thing on the left side. And we're going to multiply all of that by 0. So in my big square brackets are what was originally on each side in the rational, and what's outside is my lowest common denominator. What's neat here is on the right side, we're multiplying by 0, so that whole thing becomes 0. That's by design. This strategy of moving everything to one side makes the math really simple on the one side. On the other side, it's a little bit more complicated, but to make it really easy, what ends up happening when we distribute the lowest common denominator to each of these fractions is the part that's already in the denominator ends up dividing away, and really you're just multiplying the top of the rational by the pieces that aren't already in the denominator. So let's practice that with the first term. Our 2 times x plus 3 times x minus 1, if we multiply it by our first term, we will have an x plus 3 on the top, and we already have an x plus 3 on the bottom. So those will divide away, and you'll be left with just the original top, which was 2x plus 3, times the parts in your lowest common denominator that weren't in the denominator of your original, sorry. So that's 2 and x minus 1, since the x plus 3 divided away. So I'm going to put the 2 at the beginning. Get that there. And our x minus 1 will follow. So this is the product of multiplying our lowest common denominator by our first term. Second term is plus, the 2's will divide away, so our top will just become x plus 3 times x minus 1. And for our last term, the x minus 1's will divide away. So we'll just be left with minus 2 times x plus 3 times the original numerator, which was x plus 1. Okay, so each part that isn't in the denominator from our lowest common denominator ends up multiplying by the top because what's common divides away. So in this case, it was the x plus 3. In our second term's case, it was the 2. And in our last term's case, it was the x minus 1. Now we have this polynomial that we need to simplify. So how do we simplify? Well, we expand. So we do 2 times 2x plus 3 times x minus 1. Collect your like terms. Same thing in the middle, same thing at the end. So this will take a little bit of algebra here. Let's see if I can expand this a little bit more efficiently. All right. 2 times 2x is 4x and 6. 4x times x is 4x squared. 4x times negative 1 is negative 4x. 6 times x is 6x, and 6 times negative 4 is, hold on here, let's check that again. 6 times negative 1, it's negative 6. That's our first term expanded. Next expanded, x times x is x squared. X times negative 1 is negative x, 3x, and negative 3. This one's going to be a little tricky. Negative 2x times x is negative 2x squared. Negative 2x times 1 is negative 2x. Negative 6 times x is negative 6x, and negative 6 times 1 is negative 6. All right, equals 0. My equal signs aren't lining up anymore. That's all right. We'll make them line up after we collect our like terms. So where are my squares? I'm going to square those. Squared, squared, squared. So that's 4x squared plus x squared is 5, minus 2 is 3x squared. My x's, 4, 6, negative x, 3, negative 2, negative 6. Oh boy. Negative 4 plus 6 is 2x, 5x, 4x, negative 2x, negative 8x. Count that up one more time. I think I've done my math wrong. All right, here we go. Let's try it again. Negative 4 plus 6 is 2. Minus 1 is 1, plus 3 is 4. Minus 8, negative 4x, I was right, I did make a mistake. And our last terms, we've got negative 6. Minus 3 is negative 9. Minus 6 is negative 15. That whole thing equals 0. All right, now we're on track. Now we have a quadratic. So now we just have to factor that quadratic and solve for x. This is a complex trinomial, so we have to do 3 times negative 15, which gives us negative 45. And now we're looking for numbers that multiply to negative 45 and add to negative 4. Those numbers are negative 9x and 5x. Because negative 9 and positive 5 multiply to negative 45 and they add to negative 4. So we do decomposition. We break that middle term down into those two terms, and now we group and common factor. Common to the first two terms is 3x, and that leaves us with x minus 3. Common to the last two terms is 5, and that leaves us with x minus 3. That common binomial factor is your first factor, x minus 3, and what we're left with is 3x plus 5. And now to solve, we take each of our brackets, set it equal to 0. So from our first bracket, we get a solution of x equals 3. And from our next bracket, we get a solution of negative 5 divided by 3, negative 5 over 3. Check these numbers to make sure they're not one of your restrictions. Negative 3 and 3, different, and that is not either of those two numbers, so we have two solutions. All right, that was a challenging one, but hopefully that process you're okay with. Where it gets a little hairy is the expanding, collecting like terms, and making sure you count appropriately and end up with the right numbers once you simplify. And then to finish the process, collect like terms, factor, and solve. That's it for part 2. I'll see you for lesson 5, 5.5. That'll be our last lesson, solving rational inequalities.